This program is made possible by Atlantic Richfield Company. Energy, chemicals, minerals.
Now, my question is, these days it seems to me that the freedom of thought, not just thought, because in a way people can't interfere with that if we're speaking abstractly, but the freedom to express a thought which will change the culture is perceived by many to be threatening to the good of the whole. And so my question to you, Mortimer, is when you ask, or the question to the people around the table, when you ask, or when you define freedom as that which we should have no more liberty than what would...
Please, that's true of only one freedom. There are four freedoms here. The freedom that are limited by justice is the freedom to do as one pleases. That's the only one that's limited by justice in that way. I said that one should not be free to do as one wishes beyond the limits of not injuring. I mean, the limitation of that is one must not injure others or act against the general welfare.
But society sees my freedom of thought if I express it.
I'm not talking about your freedom of thought, though. I'm only talking about freedom of action. Let me say, Betty, you have to be very careful. You must always say which freedom you're talking about.
Number two.
Number two, but that is not a, so that freedom is totally, that freedom cannot be regulated by law, can't be affected by society. It's totally an inner freedom which the individual acknowledges a moral law and says, yes, I am free from my own passions to will as I ought.
Nothing pleases Mortimer Adler quite as much as inciting intellectual riot among non-consenting adults. When the smoke clears, he argues, so does the mind. He does it with ideas, including great ideas such as liberty.
I have said that liberty and equality are ideas men act on. They are the great values that men have fought for and struggled for. The struggle for equality is very recent, of course, but the struggle for liberty goes back as far as anything in Western history. It goes back 25 centuries when the Greeks fought the Persians, Sparta and Athens, to protect their political liberty against subjugation by the tyranny and despotism of the great king of Persia. And it's going on today.
Mortimer Adler once published 2 large volumes on the idea of liberty. It has possessed his long career as philosopher, teacher, and editor. When he first outlined the 102 great ideas of all time, liberty, of course, was among them. Now he's written a book called 6 Great Ideas, and liberty is one of them. Either we submit the idea to the real labor of thinking, says Mortimer Adler, or liberty will lose its meaning, and we'll lose our liberty. In his day, Lincoln said, "The world has never had a very good definition of the word liberty, and the American people just now are very much in want of one." Do you think that's still true?
Yes, because actually there is no definition of the word liberty. After 8 years of very hard work at the Institute of Philosophical Research, which I'm director, with a large staff looking at the whole literature, we decided that the word liberty or freedom, which are interchangeable words in English, had 4 or 5 quite distinct meanings, with a common thread running through them, but the common thread is so abstract you couldn't define it. The best I can do is say there are four major forms of freedom, or of liberty. I can say what those are very quickly, but I can't say what freedom is.
All right, do so.
Well, the first one is a freedom which is man's natural endowment, the freedom of his will, by which he's able to choose freely, and a free choice consists of being able to choose otherwise. No matter how you choose, you could have chosen otherwise. That's freedom of choice.
If you choose A, you could have chosen B.
And that, I think we do have, we do possess, though there are determinists, you know, scientists who think that man doesn't have free will. But if we have it by an inherent or native endowment. So I call that the natural freedom of self-determination.
It comes with the trip.
That's right. The second freedom, which has an ancient lineage, is called moral freedom or moral liberty. And the Christian theologians called it Christian liberty. It is a freedom that is acquired only with the acquirement of virtue and wisdom, and it consists in the freedom to will as one ought. The notion here is that, with the Christians, for example, that man is bound by original sin and doesn't will as he ought. But when with grace or with virtue he conquers his passions and acts according to his rational obedience to divine law and wills as he ought, he's free as a Christian man. This, by the way, is the meaning of Christ's statement, know the truth and it shall set you free. That's the freedom that Christ is promising, the freedom of being able to will as you ought.
Are you limiting it to Christians?
No, because a Roman Stoic, Epictetus, enslaves with manacles on his feet, said, I'm a free man, though I'm a slave and chained, because I can will as I ought.
But he can't will himself out of prison.
No. Conformed to the moral law. He means my will remains a good will, and I'm free to will righteously, regardless of the external impediments. And Boethius, who was a Christian thrown into prison by the Romans, also said he had moral liberty. But I think that probably the best expression of it is in Spinoza's Ethics. The last two books of Spinoza's Ethics are titled as follows: Of the Passions, or of Human Bondage, of the Reason, or of Human Freedom. And what Spinoza is saying there, in this second kind of freedom, is that when men are swept by their passions, their action is emotionally determined, they are not free to do as they ought. But when their reason conquers their passions and directs their action, then they are free men. This is an inner moral liberty, nothing to do with society, nothing to do with circumstances, nothing to do with the innate endowment. It must be acquired by reason and by virtue and wisdom. That's the second kind.
All right, but you must tell me what you mean by virtue and wisdom.
Well, virtue is the habitual inclination to act as one should, to make right choices, make right choices.
And wisdom?
Wisdom is the understanding of what the end of life and which the choices should be made.
So if you develop the habit of making right choices,
then you have moral freedom.
So Jacobo Timmerman, the Argentine editor who is confined for 2.5 years to
moral
prison,
freedom every moment in prison.
Because he
made the right choices.
In his mind.
He acted in accordance with his conscience as he ought. And that freedom to do that is his moral liberty, which no one can take away from him.
Would this be akin to what Viktor Frankl, who survived the German concentration camp, said when he said, what he meant when he said, I am not responsible for the circumstances in which I'm being held, but I am responsible for how I will react to these circumstances.
That's exactly what moral liberty is.
The third kind of freedom.
The third is circumstantial freedom. It has two forms. I call it circumstantial because it is not obtained or possessed by virtue and wisdom. It is not an innate endowment or a natural quality. It is something that external circumstances, the circumstances of one's society, one's political framework, confers upon one or does not, deprives one of. And the language I use here, it has two forms, the individual form and the political form. The individual form is under circumstances which leave the individual without impediment, not under coercion, constraint, or duress, or lack of enabling means. He is able to do as he wishes. He can act as he pleases. The great English economist said, a poor man is not free to dine at the Ritz. Walk in, but he's not free to dine there because he lacks in his pocket the enabling means. The four things that are the four circumstantial factors that confer circumstantial freedom to do as one pleases upon an individual are first, absence of coercion, absence of constraint, absence of duress, and the possession of enabling means.
And these all depend on circumstances to a large extent beyond my control?
Absolutely.
Or totally beyond my control?
This freedom is conferred upon you by society or not, or you're deprived of it by society. The man who's put in prison, the man who's chained, has circumstances that deprive him of this freedom. Now, that's only one form. The other form is political liberty. It's also circumstantial because either you are an enfranchised citizen, or, if, for example, before the woman suffrage amendment in the United States at the beginning of this century, no female American had political liberty. Because political liberty, under the circumstances of being an enfranchised citizen in a republic or a constitutional government, either one, could be a constitutional monarchy, is a person who is governed with his own consent and with a voice in his own government.
A share in the sovereignty.
Share in the sovereignty. That again, is circumstantially conferred, or you're deprived of it. By those who, when the blacks and when women were disfranchised, not given suffrage, they lacked political liberty. They were governed as subjects, and almost as children. Even if they were despotically ruled in a paternalistic, benevolent way, they were still ruled as children are ruled, not as adults.
So you're saying there are four kinds of liberty by your definition. Natural liberty?
Of choice, freedom of choice.
required a moral liberty,
It's freedom to will as one ought.
circumstantial liberty,
That's freedom of individual action in society. If I'm not impeded, constrained, coerced, and if I have the enabling means, I can act as I please. That's the freedom to act as I please.
and
The fourth is when I'm granted citizenship with suffrage under a constitutional government, I have the freedom of being able to be governed by with my own consent, not as a subject, but as a free citizen, and with a voice in my own government.
if Jefferson is right that all human beings are entitled to liberty, what is the basis of that entitlement? What justifies it?
Man is by nature not only an animal with being with free choice, which gives him the right to freedom of action, but he's also a political animal. And he's born as a political animal to be a citizen,
To take
to have
part
a
in-
voice, to take part in politics. Hence, his nature as a political animal, his nature as a political animal entitles him to political liberty, because a political animal that didn't exercise political liberty wouldn't be fulfilled. I think those are the two natural bases of the entitlement to freedom of action on the one hand and political liberty on the other.
The difficult part to see, of course, is the proposition that people are born with a freedom that is inherent in human nature.
I don't think it's too difficult. If I said that man and man alone has an intellect, other animals have perceptual intelligence, but only man has intellection or understanding, conceptual intelligence, and along with that, only man has a will that is free. I mean, I think these two things of free will and conceptual intelligence, being able to think and understand as only man can think and understand, are the distinctive characteristics of the human race. These are the properties of human nature. And it's these two properties that underlie freedom of action, the entitlement to freedom of action, and underlie freedom of political liberty.
And we have them by being human.
That's right.
In our nature.
Right.
What if we are wrong about human nature?
If we are wrong about human nature, if we are not different from the animals in kind, if we differ only in degree from the higher mammals, I cannot state a rational justification for a different treatment from men and beasts. The Roman law made the fundamental distinction between persons and things. The word person is a very important word. I have never found anyone who's willing to call a cow a person or a dog a person. Now, why not? Why do we refuse the word person to these animals we love and care for, our domestic pets? We sometimes joke and say, my cat's like a person, but we know we're joking, that they're not persons. Now, that word person means that we, by being persons, not things, have a dignity. And all of us, every human being, from the least to the greatest in terms of all the difference in talents and aptitudes, is a person, has personal dignity, and the rights that we have, such as the right to freedom, the right to political liberty, are our personal attributes.
Well, let's go back to Jefferson then. Jefferson calls this right to freedom an unalienable right. What does that word mean to you philosophically?
It means two things. In the first place, it is a right that is antecedent to all governments. It is not a right like a legal right granted by a constitution or granted by a law. Legal rights are legally enacted. Constitutional rights are constitutionally enacted. Unalienable rights are the inherent natural rights that we have by being human. We have a right to live in a society where the circumstances confer upon us the freedom to act as we please.
And that is unalienable.
Unalienable.
By Jefferson's definition.
It isn't given by government and it can't be taken away. It can be violated, but it can't be, it isn't a gift of government.
Under what circumstances can anyone be deprived of the exercise of the right of liberty?
By criminal conduct. A criminal who has acted against the general welfare of the community, the common good, violated a law, the right is not taken away. He has forfeited, for the time of his incarceration, the exercise of the right. The moment the prison doors open, the exercise, the right is always there, as a human being. The prison doors open and the exercise of the right is restored. He has paid for his misconduct by the forfeit of that exercise for a term of years. Now, that's the only trouble with the death penalty. One of the, you know there's a great deal of talk. The reason why the death penalty is a serious question is because there can be no restoration of the right. If it's taken away, it's taken away.
You're really taking the right, not just the exercise of the right, and you can never give it back. Mark Twain said that it is by the goodness of God that we have in this country three unspeakably precious things: freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, and the prudence never to practice either of them. Now I want to ask you, should anyone have unlimited freedom, or how would you state the general principle that justifies the limitation of liberty?
With regard to the circumstantial freedom of action, the freedom to do as one pleases, I think the principle is very simply stated. A human being, a person, should have as much freedom as justice allows, as much freedom as he can use justly. And that I can translate into the most simple terms: as much freedom as he can use without harming anybody else, without injuring anybody else, or acting against the general welfare of the community. Any action on his part that injures the welfare of the community or another person is illicit action. It should be, in some sense, criminal action, and therefore prohibited.
Well, if...
I mean, in other words, to prevent a criminal from injuring somebody is not to, I say, is not to take away his freedom.
Well, it is to take away his freedom.
Let me
to do as he pleases.
Let me introduce a word that many of the writers on freedom have introduced, particularly John Locke. To do as one pleases, if what one pleases to do is a violation of other people's rights or an injury to them, is not freedom, not liberty, but license. Milton once said, liberty, they cry, when all they want is license. The criminal is being deprived of license, but not of liberty. And I would go further and say, therefore, just laws deprive no one of any liberty, except the criminal. What do you say that? Just laws deprive no one of any liberty, and the criminal who is compelled to obey them, or is prevented from committing a crime by fear of the punishment that he would get if he were caught, is only giving up license, not liberty.
And the failure to enforce the law deprives us
Precisely,
of our liberty, or can
precisely.
deprive us of our liberty.
John Locke is, I think, one of in the English tradition, Locke's second essay on civil government has some marvelous chapters on liberty where he says, where there is no law, there is no liberty. Law is the bulwark of liberty.
So society has to take steps
Right.
to deprive all of us, in a sense, of some of our freedom. My freedom to punch you in the nose.
That's right. See,
Nobody has the freedom to cry fire in a crowded theater.
If the freedom to punch me in the nose is a freedom you should not have, then you ought to not call it freedom but license. I think that's the only way to clarify it. I think Locke is right.
When people obey unjust laws, do they lose their freedom? And I speak out of the civil rights movement, which came into being precisely because there were unjust laws.
Exploring the intricacies of any great idea, says Mortimer Adler, is an almost endless process. The course of pursuit is affected by the experiences of those who come to the journey by a different light. Seminars at the Aspen Institute in Colorado, which Adler helped to organize around the classic literature of Western thought, are mixtures of divergent opinions held by contrasting personalities. This session on liberty is no exception. An old controversy is quickly joined. Who shall judge when liberty weighs too heavily? What is to regulate the conflict between the pursuit of liberty and the pursuit of equality? And how much dissent can liberty allow?
So I would say that the civil rights movement did one very important thing for this country, not just for black people, but for this country. It taught us that civil disobedience, that is, objecting to and deliberately violating unjust laws,
As Martin Luther King did.
Yes, can in fact attain for us a degree of freedom. That is to say that laws were eliminated. The Voting Rights Act came into being. A lot of other things related to housing, schooling, etc., came out of civil disobedience of unjust laws. And people have a lot of problems with that because most people are law-abiding. But I would suggest that civil disobedience has to continue today because there are still unjust laws.
How about the other face of the thing? If the laws were just and persons obeyed them, would they lose their freedom? Does obedience to law deprive a man of freedom if the laws are just?
Well, if the law is just, as long as we have a universal definition of just laws.
Suppose it from what you know what a just law is.
Well, we can't in a practical term presume that all laws are just.
Know that.
Even when there's participatory democracy, we can't always assume that. So I guess I'd have to qualify it by saying if indeed the massive number of people felt that the laws were just and they came into being because the people wanted them, then perhaps we wouldn't lose our freedom if we obeyed them. But I have a lot of qualifications, as you can see.
I understand. Alan?
I would like to answer Ruth this, that if she claims the right to disobey the laws, which she clearly does.
Only unjust laws.
So, if other people claim the same right, how do you deny it to them?
I don't.
Fine.
I
so
believe
that obedience to the law, in your view, is only provisional, in that any group objecting to it that it is unjust may challenge the law.
I believe any law that is unjust to any group of people, whether it's women, ethnic minority groups, etc., ought to be challenged.
Yeah, fine. Suppose it's a group of people who believe strongly that there ought to be inequality, and they challenge the law because they think it is unjust to them in not recognizing the inequality which they believe to be right. You deny them the right?
Because, well, I presume that we believe.
There are people
No,
like
wait a minute.
this.
No, if we follow the Constitution of our country, which is to say equal protection under the law, et cetera, then we can't presume to have people who think that inequality has to be a natural law.
Of course, but if equality is equality between equal people, and they believe that people are not equal, they would believe that equality then required inequality as a form of justice between unequal people. How would you deny them the right to revolt?
That is precisely the problem of racism, discrimination, prejudices, etc.
Ruth, may I suggest that...
That's easy, because they could then reply that your difficulty was the problem.
When Martin Luther...
They have.
You have to have, yes, well, that's all right, but I think that you are in danger there of opening a very wide door. I happen to sympathize with your views on it, but I do see that philosophically one opens a wide door.
No, sympathy isn't what I want. Equality. Equality is what I'm saying.
Well, is liberty the freedom to do and say and think anything?
That's one of the I'm sorry, I cannot possibly answer your question without saying it's one form of life. There is no such thing as liberty itself. There's a common meaning that runs through these four forms and other forms as well. It's very difficult to take that so thinly that it's common to all four, but you have to talk about the different forms, not about liberty per se.
I say you do not lose liberty by obeying the law if the law is just, and we'll hold for the moment the question of justice.
Right.
We're just supposing that there is such a thing as a just law. Maybe there isn't. But this is a hypothetical question.
Right.
If there is a just law, do I lose liberty when I obey the law? Indeed, I would argue just the opposite, that in the absence of just law, I have absolutely no liberties. In the absence of law, preferably just law, I live in anarchy. In a state of anarchy, I enjoy no liberty except the illusory liberty that I'm the biggest guy on the block, I got the biggest gang around me, and I can beat everybody else into submission. I would suggest that if you want to examine just law, start with the first 10 amendments of the Constitution of the United States. They guarantee to me the right to speak and to assemble, a variety of other rights. They are laws. They are just laws. In the absence of those just laws, I might very well lose all my liberties to some mean guy down the street with his gang, or I might very easily lose my liberties to the government. A government may also deprive one of liberty. Now, I'm ready to grant that if you define the term liberty to mean the right to do anything, anytime I want to anyone, under any circumstances, then true, a just law does circumscribe my liberty. But I prefer the other word license. I think if liberty is defined as license, and of course, by definition, any law limits my liberty.
Right.
But I think that the word license has a separate meaning, and I'm not just playing around with words. The hell with the words. I am concerned with the concept. I believe that if every individual is turned loose to play the game as that individual wants to, without any rules to the game, my freedom is absolutely in jeopardy. For that reason, I maintain just laws guarantee liberty, and my obeying the just law is my reinforcement of my liberties.
Thank you. Bob?
Well, I disagree totally with Gus in that his first part of his statement that just laws do not limit liberty or freedom. And if I may, I'd also like to ask you, Mortimer, what you said. No one has the right, of course, to harm others or to go contrary to the common good. And that's an expression or a term that I also don't quite understand, because again, it's difficult to know what the common good is versus
We talk
the
about the
majority
general
good.
We do talk about the general welfare, don't we? John Stuart Mill talked about the greatest happiness for the greatest number, various forms of this. But let me, on this question, the great opposition in English thought, at least, is between John Stuart Mill and John Locke. Mill did hold that as the sphere of law enlarges, the sphere of liberty diminishes. And as the sphere of law diminishes, the sphere of liberty enlarges. That's Mill's view. Locke took a quite contrary view. He held that no liberty at all is ever lost under just laws, that the virtuous man is utterly free when he obeys the just law, because he can do anyway what the just law requires, and only the criminal, the antisocial conduct of the criminal, is restrained by a just law, and the criminal thinks he's lost liberty, but using the phrase that Gus used, Locke says that's license, not liberty. I mean, everything turns, I mean, let me just say, in this matter...
Example of this.
Yeah, please.
A very current one. I feel living in New York State, my liberty is being endangered. My liberty to breathe air, my liberty to swim in the lakes, my liberty to get clean fish out of the lakes in the Adirondacks. I can go on and on and on like that. These are things I need. Food and air are basic to my life. I'm being deprived of that. And I know within 50 years it's going to be impossible if things go the way they do, and it's because of the acid rain. The acid rain come out of various plants in various parts of the country where people are doing their business in a completely innocent sort of a way. But what they are doing is going to make life impossible for me within the foreseeable future. It will interfere with my liberty. I am going to call for a law that says you have to regulate those people. You have to see to it that they do not poison my future. That is a law, and it's a law that, true, is going to restrain them. At the same time, it's going to give me greater liberty. Now, a social decision has to be made, and you may want to do this on a cost-effective basis, balancing their right against my right. The truth of the matter is that if I do not intervene with law, I, as a defenseless citizen, lose basic liberties.
Sure.
Well, you also have caused the loss of liberty to others, and therefore it is, to a great degree, backfired on yourself when you limited, for instance, oil and gas exploration in the Northeast for many years. You realized in the long term you thought you were getting more liberty and freer choice, but you were in the long term really losing and bringing on a possibility of acid rain.
Unjust law. We're talking about laws that are just. Let's add wise as well.
I think the problem that it faces one at this stage is, what about those people who say we don't accept that it is a just law, and those people who say we don't accept that this society could ever produce any just laws? What are the limits of toleration to dissent?
That's right. Limits to dissent.
I think this is a very interesting question, because I think that you have done your best to provide us, and I go a long way with it, with what one might call a series of logical steps. But at some point, the logic breaks on a circular definition. And at that point, you then have to come to politics. And politics is the balancing of unpleasant alternatives, if you like.
You have to compromise then. You have to
That's
bring
it.
everything together and say, okay, we've got to make a deal here.
Yeah, we never get out of that.
But nobody ever talks about the one kind of simple word that I associate with liberty, and it's, are we fair? You know, do we treat
That
things
word introduces
in
the
a
notion of
sense?
justice.
We're back to justice.
Well, I don't know
You
if
do
they
understand
don't.
these three ideas are very closely related. But I do think there is some point, I'd like to enforce upon you, of holding back for the moment as to the details of justice. We all use the words, and let's stay with freedom. Francis?
That's one level. You go to the next level, and that is the level where diversities of a profound nature come into the picture, and where differences of vision of what human being and human value and all that come into conflict. That is a situation where Alan's system came into my tribe and brought the police, and where there had not been any police. There had not been any need for the police. But suddenly we have a different concept of government, a government which had legislative authority, which had machinery for enforcing its laws, and we said this is right or wrong, and I had not the power to observe my own concepts of what is right or wrong. And therefore, there were prisons, and new things came in. Well, they're part of my world today. The question then is, we have a pluralistic situation where you cannot live by the norms of consensus alone anymore. Then we come to the realm that you people are talking about, the limits of liberty within that context. Well, that poses a new question to me, and that goes to the question of objectivity. If you have a new system in Ireland where two systems are coming together, in your country where minorities are confronting a majority which has established a system of justice and liberties, what do you do when you come to the United Nations, where each country comes with its own vision of things? Well, that's the level where I feel there is need for reassessing criteria of liberty, limits of liberty, and redefining in an objective, however objective we can be, to set new criteria for both liberty and the constraints of liberty.
Yes.
I have a definition of democracy, and it involves a relationship between the rights and responsibilities of majorities and minorities. It is a system of government in which the majority has the right to make the law and has the responsibility of respecting the inalienable rights of the minorities, right down to the last person. Minorities have certain guaranteed rights, inalienable, and the minority has the responsibility of abiding by the law. That's a definition, and it is perfect, except that it doesn't work. The reason for it is that it is like a Euclidean triangle. It's an imaginary thing. When you get down to it, built into that concept of democracy is conflict.
Surely.
Because it finally gets down to the question of what is an inalienable right. Is it the right to vote? Is it the right to food stamps, which is part of the right to life? Is it the right to be free of acid rain? It goes on and on and on. Now, how do we resolve that question? I think that if we look for a formula which will give us an eternal solution to the question of the locus of inalienable right, which are really inalienable rights, and expand with time, I think we will find ourselves engaged in a rather useless exercise. But if we take our exercise too seriously, we will end up as authoritarians who impose a rather narrow view on the total society. My feeling runs this way, that conflict is the essence of democracy. A democracy without conflict is not a democracy. And the whole question of just exactly where rights end and where they begin is always determined in conflict. After we wrote the Constitution, people did not have the right to vote unless they had property. So they made riots. And after they made their riots, they got the right to vote in this country. We have recourses. The civilized way, of course, to conduct the conflict is to go to a court. And in effect, Martin Luther King really went to court. But he had to make a case to go to court.
Sure.
But he did more than that. You go to courts, but you don't always win in courts. Who says the Supreme Court is always fair? And who always says the Supreme Court's word is the word of God? Supreme Court has very often been narrow and prejudiced and mean and oppressive. Occasionally it's not. But we have another recourse in a democracy. The recourse is to conscience. And the minority goes out there, makes its point, and tries to convert the majority by getting to its conscience. But we all know the limits of conscience when the exercise of conscience comes into conflict with self-interest. And worse, when conscience comes into conflict with our own cultural conditionings, falls flat.
Gus, can I stop you for a moment? Because you haven't answered the first question, which is, if you think that Jefferson is right in holding that all human beings are entitled to liberty, and let that be either circumstantial freedom of action to do as one pleases or political liberty, the question I'd really like to hear is, what is the basis of it? What underlies that entitlement?
I don't care whether my right comes from God, from nature, from Socrates, from a reading of Mortimer Adler, or just from my gut. My own feeling is that the struggle for liberty throughout the ages has not come from God, nor from reading, nor from Constitution. It has come now and then from the feeling of human beings that they can no longer tolerate the oppression. And it comes through simple conflict. I want to sing a little paean of praise in honor of conflict and not engage in a research that assumes that you can have a free society that could be continued as a free society without constant conflict.
Would you include your praise for the Islamic Revolution in Iran as a liberating force?
I do not think that all revolutions liberate. In my vocabulary, there's a thing called the counter-revolution. The counter-revolution is a revolution I don't like, and the revolution I do like is called a revolution.
So there's a right. So those who make revolution have a right, and those who make counter-revolution don't, which is to say, what I do is okay, and what you do isn't.
Shirley?
I simply wanted to add that while the intellectual dilemma that Alan has posed you is a very troublesome one, in perhaps more pragmatic terms, as long as one realizes that civil disobedience means peaceful disobedience,
Absolutely.
and as long as one also realizes that the way to test the justness of the law is to suffer the penalty the law imposes.
And that's what Martin Luther King did.
That's what he did. And as long as one recognizes that there is much more than simply saying, I shall not obey the law. Many people who want to do that do not want to pay any penalty at all. It's like deciding to sign up to be a martyr without ever bleeding at all.
Well, you're absolutely right. Let me just say this. Martin Luther King taught very well that this is a last resort, it is a strategy, it is a tactic. But if one decides and chooses to disobey an unjust law, one must be prepared without objection to suffer the consequences.
I'll come back to you.
Come back on.
Yes, please, Alan.
Because I do sympathize, as Ruth well knows, I sympathize
Of course.
with the civil rights movement. Suppose you find a situation like Northern Ireland. Since I'm an Englishman, I'm allowed to introduce that question. There you have two communities, neither of which is prepared to accept any rights of the other. What happens then when each claims the right to disobey the law if it means giving rights to the other? At that point, it seems to be one gets the dissolution of civil society. Mm-hmm. And I think one has to see that the situation which Ruth has described, I can understand, and I regard Martin Luther King as a great man who behaved with great courage and with great restraint. But there are situations in the world where people do challenge the law and say, I don't accept it as a just law, and so the bomb.
We have civil war then.
If I understand Alan, he's saying that dissent must be limited at the point beyond which the conflicts it seeks to contain create greater conflicts. That is, if dissent creates greater conflicts than those which they are trying,
then there wouldn't be revolutions.
I would disagree.
Revolutions.
I would disagree for this reason. Change is very difficult to bring about. Social change is enormously difficult. And while I understand what you're saying, that you can't have chaos, the fact of the matter is most of the major social changes have grown out are chaotic conditions. And while they're unpleasant, and while I personally don't like them, and while most people don't, I believe that we have to allow dissent to the point that the law, the rule, the regulation alters.
And you were prepared to risk civil war? Because we got it in
indeed,
Britain. We got it in Northern Ireland.
I think,
You really mean that, Ruth?
Oh, I really do.
You really mean
Now,
that
I'm
with
not-
the machine guns in the streets? And bombs? You mean that? Because I can see it in Northern
Well,
Ireland any
then,
day.
in a civilization like ours, we ought to be able to change short of that.
Yeah, but
what I'm
that's what
suggesting-
people drive it.
Well, we
No,
have.
no, what I'm suggesting,
Let's put
I
it this
think we
way. We
can.
already have, to a large extent. We have made great progress. Let's admit to that.
Not without a lot of chaos, though.
All right. No, agreed.
Chaos is an ambiguous word.
Chaos is one thing, death is another.
And so starvation, because all the arrangements break down and the milk is not delivered.
No, I'm not proposing that.
That's what civil chaos means.
I'm saying that civil disobedience has to be one of the alternatives that we use. That may bring about very extreme kinds of conflict that ultimately result in
Death.
death.
Where are the situations that he's talking about Northern Ireland, which is real but removed from most Americans? Where are the situations today where you think dissent ought to be pressed further than it is presently being pressed?
Jobs. I believe that we have to do something to bring to the conscious level in this country the need for not only more jobs, but equal opportunity in attaining those jobs.
There were
and
riots.
there ought to be a civil
Riots
rights
in Britain.
movement.
Last
No,
6
there ought
months.
to be a civil rights movement addressed to this issue, because unless we solve the economic problems in this country, which relate to jobs, we're never going to have the other kinds of equalities
Good
that we
example.
talk about.
I want to ask Ruth if she'd go back to the Luddites, who everybody knows in the 19th century smashed machines. So you come to smashing the computers and technology because that is what is going to create fewer jobs, and that's inevitable.
But can't we remedy the situation short of that?
I don't know,
Those
but
are
I'm
irresponsible
certainly,
positions.
of course, one's prepared to look for it. But when people talk about investment, they don't mean investment in jobs, they mean investment in capital equipment, which is labor-saving and will destroy jobs. Because catching up on you, the fact there aren't going to be any jobs for black or white. And then what happens? Do we have a war between black and white?
Are there limits to dissent?
No, I don't think there are limits to dissent. I don't think that we can have a sane world if we put limits on dissent. I think that what Alan considers to be anarchy, I don't consider to be anarchy. I consider to be sanity. I don't think that oppressed people can maintain their sanity. R.D. Lang said, when you destroy a people's experience, they become destructive. And that's what we see happening in Watts, and that's what we see happening at Wounded Knee and Alcatraz. In other words, the potential for violence is not is a part of suppression, is a part of repression. There isn't anything you can do about it. To talk about it as putting limits on it, almost on a cookbook level, is to talk about it as if it were something over which we have control.
Absolutely.
It's an emotional predisposition.
But wait a minute, you're talking about examples, and I understand it perfectly, which are basically intercultural, interracial.
Yes.
What about the ideological? You wouldn't stop Hitler coming to power?
Alan, let us be clear.
Not
We
me.
believe in the democratic process.
Of course, that's
We are
why we're
not
participating
advocating
in it.
revolution.
Right.
Not advocating
But the
that.
democratic process can be misused.
Of
Well,
course,
of course, any
it
process
can be
can
by
be
anyone. It can be
misused
used by
against
the,
But
us.
it
against
has been misused. We have clear examples that the leadership has misused the democratic process.
I'm not worried about the leadership. I'm worried about
other
the
people can
contenders.
misuse it. But I would say that we need to recognize we're going to have creative tension. We're going to have chaos.
Beautiful words,
No,
Ruth.
no,
what
no,
you mean is
creativity.
blood.
No,
I feel that.
no,
I think
A lot of
that's
people feel it.
Listen,
No,
listen.
but
Martin
that
Luther
is the
King
fear.
did not listen. Martin Luther King did not advocate violence.
Marvelous.
All right.
I admire him enormously. If you can
wait a minute,
control it,
wait a
fine.
minute, wait a minute. You can control it if the system understands what you're after and believe that you have a part in it. For example, there would not have been any violence in the nonviolent movement had the leadership responded to the request for rights that should have been there.
Had they
anyway.
acted.
May
Had
I
they
say-
acted.
May I
That's
say
the
that,
point.
dear?
Had they acted.
If only the troops had been withdrawn, Hitler would never have used his stormtroopers to come to power, because the system would have responded.
We're out of
Quick.
time.
I would like to answer your first question by saying that I think that Jefferson assumed, as I do, that biology is democratic, or at least that there is an equality, not a
Right, I agree.
in biology. But I think, and this is what Ruth and I, the point that we're having difficulty making, and I think maybe together we could make it more firmly. That's the fact that there is a historical contradiction to this notion of biology as equal. In the case, let me give you a couple of examples. After 1492, it took a considerable amount of time, I think 2 decades, for the Vatican to determine whether Indians were or were not human beings.
I know the debates very well.
And then, and unfortunately, it was decided we were human beings so that we did have souls and our souls could be converted. There goes the neighborhood.
But you do have, Edward, you do have souls.
In other words, where do we draw the line in terms of how much we insist that our value structure, my value structure in this case, must be applied on the basis of international law?
That's a question of practice rather than a question of
Well,
principle.
but liberty is insignificant to me unless it is practice.
Can I stay with you just a moment longer, Mr. Backer? Would you be saying, in answer to the question that I put to Gus, that it is in our natures, using the word nature instead of biology there for a moment, it is in our natures that we have an entitlement to every human being, a human being is entitled to freedom?
I hate to give you this answer. In my nature, yes. I don't know about anybody else's.
But your nature, I hope you think that my nature is exactly the same as yours. I hope you think so. I hope you think I'm a human being.
No, of course. You understand. But you understand what I'm trying to say. I'm not so sure that I can determine for others what I can determine for myself, which goes back to, the right to your own body and your own mind, which is also an important aspect.
Mortimer, I'm a little bit reminded of the United Nations by this discussion.
Should be.
The discussions that we have in the UN and various bodies, not only in New York, do not center around this question, but it becomes apparent that, take for instance the two covenants on human rights, on social and economic and political human rights. They're drafted by Western experts. They were accepted by the world universally. But here again, I have a suspicion that there are a number of peoples, nations, cultures who do not really accept this. It is being handed to them. Here you are. Now, inalienable rights that Gus was referring to also, and you did, this is a term that we have exported to the third world, and it's coming back to us. And we're asked in the UN to accept a demand for the inalienable rights of the Palestinians, as represented through the PLO, or of the people of Namibia, as represented by SWAPO. Now, all of a sudden, the same thing comes back to us, and we feel awfully uneasy with what we have told others in the world to accept as something useful, helpful, necessary even. Now the answer comes back to us, and then we find all kinds of wonderful excuses. That's the communist movement, they're paid by the Soviets, and this is a terrorist group, and so this may all be true, but we're being handed back the same tools that we gave them to achieve the freedom. Don't people in Africa or in Asia think about entirely different, not all of them, but some entirely different concepts of freedom and liberty?
Come back, John.
I want to try
to
answer both.
I'll come back to you on
what
this,
I understand
please.
are both the sets of questions that were raised. And I think what Rudy suggests points up the difficulty. Because if you say the right derives from our knowledge of human nature, it is open to others to have different views of human nature. They may be wrong. You may be right. But it will be very difficult to persuade the people in the countries that Rudy is talking about that they should take the UN Charter's view of human rights because someone can assure them that that's based on the right view of human nature. I would suggest the right comes from, since we're dealing with relationships among people, from the theory that is essentially the social contract theory, which may lead to many of the results you get to, but starts from a different premise. That it simply says if people are going to live together and decide what arrangements they ought to have for themselves, ought to have, in your terms, they ought to do it not by presuming to know what human nature requires, but simply by asking themselves, what system would they consider fundamentally fair if they had to live in it without knowing what their role would be? I think you answer some basic questions by that inquiry, and you also do not answer too many of the detailed practical questions. The minute you open it up to human nature, although you, Mortimer, wisely limit it. Many others don't. Many injustices have been done in history in the name of carrying out either God's will or human nature.
I'm thoroughly conscious of that.
Could I come back to John and ask him if this is any help? I'm not sure, but I would put it to the question, drawing from another part of your exposition of this problem, Mortimer, and that's this, that I am prepared to suffer the restriction of my liberty because other people are restricted in their liberty to invade mine. I find this,
Yes.
in our modern world, important. Does that help?
I think it does help, Alan. I think what that does is begin to describe a very important principle of justice. It describes a condition under which you're willing to limit your liberty for a larger purpose, or indeed for your own purpose, because you find the exercise of the liberties that will result under that limitation are full-bodied.
Yeah.
And you're worried that if you have unlimited liberty at the moment, you may end up with very little liberty in the end.
Yes.
So you define your liberty as Mortimer does, subject to just restraints, which I think is a very admirable way of doing it. It, of course, then puts the next question, who is to decide what the just restraints are?
Yeah, that's it. That's my point. But the other one is, and perhaps it's more important, that if you don't set limits to violence, then what will happen? If I were in my country, where there's been violence recently, if I were in a situation where government is going to say, we can't set limits to violence, I think it's pretty mindless violence at the moment. I don't think it's behind a program, but it's violent. Then I think I'm not going to sit there and let it happen. I'm going to organize. We turn to vigilantes. We turn, in fact, to a prelude to civil war. So my argument is really this, that if you look at it in terms of nuclear war, if you look at it in terms of lesser war, which might escalate, if you look at it in terms of revolution, I think there are limits to our disagreement. I think that just because you approve of some of the forms of dissent, beware that in your approval you don't carry it to the point where you destroy the community within which you want the improvements to take place.
What about the citizen who exercises his or her suffrage, but finds himself or herself in the minority on an important political issue? Has he or she been deprived of his or her liberty?
No. And that's an interesting point. It's one that I think Locke understands and Mill does not understand. When I consent to the framework of government, which is the United States and its Constitution, I am consenting to majority rule. There is no other principle of government. It may not be a simple majority, maybe a two-thirds majority, but it's majority rule. Therefore, in any election in which I find myself in the adversely affected minority, I have to concur in the decision of the majority because I've accepted as a rule that the majority shall prevail. It isn't against my will, it's with my will. If I had been the majority and they had been the minority, I would expect them to conform to the majority's decision. You can't have majority rule and say that a minority is being infringed upon by the majority's decision. The moment I accept a due process of law in which the principle is majority rule, then the decision of the majority is my decision, even though I didn't vote that way.
But if that proposition were fully obliged in society, there would never be dissent.
No, I say, I accepted the majority's decision as my decision because I voted under a condition which agreed to, consented to majority rule. Now then, I still hold my minority opinions or beliefs or commitments. I therefore will try to change by persuasion, by political action, at the next election, the role of the majority and the minority. I'm free to do that by public assembly, by writing, by speaking, by politicking in a variety of ways.
And
As long as the majority rule is not changed, I must abide by it by free consent because I've consented to the principle. Just look, if I say I accept majority rule, but I won't accept any majority decision that isn't mine, that's nonsense.
What is the role, then, of dissent, of the kind of dissent we saw in the 40s and 50s and 60s on civil rights, human rights?
I think what
black suffrage.
Martin Luther King did, and this is the right thing to do, he disobeyed what he thought was an unjust law, let's say the Jim Crow law, which is unjust discrimination against blacks. Disobeyed the law, peacefully submitted to arrest, he and his friends, went to jail, wrote a letter from jail, and then through that process brought the case to the Supreme Court of the United States and had the Jim Crow law nullified as unconstitutional because unjust. That is the purpose of civil dissent. That is resistance to civil government as a method of changing the laws. Now, when
He
civil...
still consented to the system.
Yes,
but
he did. By going to jail peacefully.
So that you think there are limits to liberty and there are limits to
To
dissent.
My ideal of a just government is one in which the minority, and there's always going to be a minority in a just government where the majority ruling obtains, right? Where the minority has ample means of civil dissent by due process of law without any chance of violence taking place. That'd be ideal, wouldn't it?
You remain a utopian.
Yeah, well, but that's what due process of law should mean. A civil government should be one in which all disputes, all differences of opinion can be settled by due process of law.
In your mind, I know you have an idea of the ideal government, even though you know we haven't achieved it. But philosophically, how would you, the metaphysician, grade our democracy today?
May I step back a moment and say, you do realize that a democratic constitution in the United States is less than 100 years old. When you realize that not until the woman suffrage amendment was half the population enfranchised. Democracy is constitutional government with really universal suffrage and the securing of all natural rights. Now, we almost have universal suffrage now. Almost have it, because there's still some impediments in some sections of the country for the exercise of that right. I do not think we have yet secured all natural rights. And I think the most serious defect in the democracy of our country is strikingly indicated by the way people talk about the officials in Washington. They refer to the people who occupy public offices in Washington as the government. That isn't the government. The government is in the people of the United States. The people of the United States, the citizens with suffrage, are the principal rulers of this country. The office holders, in office only for a time being, are their instruments. They are the servants of the people. They are we ought to talk not about a change of government when we have an election, but a change of administrations. That's the administration of government. We are the government. We, the people, are the government of the United States.
So what grade would you give us?
B minus.
This, then, is an unfinished republic, and our work toward life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness remains.
Let's go on. It only began a little while ago, by the way. It's not a long history. We have a long, given the existence of the planet, we don't blow it up, we have a long way to go to improve the democracy of the United States.
Mortimer Adler. In our next film, we'll explore the idea of equality. I'm Bill Moyers.
For a transcript of this program, send $3 to Ideas, Post Office Box 900, New York, New York, 10101. This program was made possible by Atlantic Richfield Company, Energy, Chemicals, Minerals.